You know how there are those cases of people literally worshipping money to the point where it gets kind of ridiculous? You know how, like, the ABBA song goes, like, money, money, money must be funny in a rich man's world. Well, as it turns out, this kind of greed and materialism has existed for many years, since ancient times, as far as I could tell. Though nowadays, we try to tell people not to worship money so much, as it won't give you happiness in the long run, nor can it truly give you the power or influence that you need. But it shows that, unfortunately, most people did not get the message and still continue to literally worship money, which becomes a huge problem and a major concern, at least psychologically speaking. In fact, it got to the point where there were indeed gods or deities that were based around this type of worship, like literally worshiping money. Even the article for one on TV Tropes has like titled their this kind of phenomenon known as the almighty dollar, as it talks about the various cultures and religions that focus on the idea of wealth, money, prosperity being personified into actual, like, I guess, gods or deities, as people would pray to those specific gods or deities to like bless or provide them with wealth and good fortune. Though, well, like you'd think they would talk about like coins or bills or paper money of some kind, but in the ancient times, there were societies that didn't even have those kinds of monetary items and preferred to simply trade or barter goods through food or cattle or even grains, as that was what actually made people rich at the time. Though, while it is understandable for some people to want money or wealth to survive, as, let's face it, this entire world runs on money at this point. However, there are some who, as you already know, like, who unfortunately take things too far and sacrifice not only their own morality and sanity, but also lives for money as well. In fact, let me explain some of like the cultures and how they approach this kind of almost literal money worship. In Christianity, Jesus states how no one could serve two masters, as Mammon, which meant money or wealth in general, and God were considered separate beings and could never be worshipped at the same time, because money worship was pretty bad even back in the day of Jesus' existence, especially if you take into consideration what Jesus did to the people who made the mistake of turning the holy temple to a marketplace. Of course, Jesus himself would not take this lightly and point out how prioritizing money over everything else was a huge no-no. It also did not help that the Pharisees, who were basically Jesus' arch enemies, cared more about making money and getting power for themselves rather than actually having faith or caring for the people. Even worse, one of the biggest ways back then to make money was through the slave business, which the Bible clearly states was a sin in itself, and as a result, Mammon was also associated with it. I mean, why else would the Bible state that the root of all money, the root of all evil is loving money and not money itself? Over time, the concept of Mammon would end up growing to something more demonic, as people interpreted this concept as one of the seven princes of hell, who represented the greedy and materialistic nature of humans in general. Interestingly enough, in the Old Testament, there was apparently a Canaanite god named Gad, who was considered the god of fortune to the people, at least in some translations of the Bible, or even the god of fate. And yet, weirdly enough, the founder of Israel himself, Jacob, named one of his sons Gad, though whether he named his son specifically after this particular god is anyone's guess. Even more ironic is that there are some who like preach about this supposed prosperity theology, at least in some Protestant branches, as despite the fact that most of their doctrine and theology goes completely against what Jesus was teaching, and you could say like Jesus would be rolling in his grave, as like Barney from The Simpsons says, at least in that one episode. And the fact that even the churches that I've been to in the past, both Protestant and Baptist, also do not approve of this theology, which definitely gives a sort of, I guess, a red flag or a warning sign that this particular theology theology is not something you'd want to find yourself following. And unfortunately, it's because of this theology that Christianity doesn't really look very good in the modern day, along with some other rather scandalous or questionable aspects. But enough about that. Now, going back to ancient times, where in Mesopotamian culture religion, which was commonly worshipped by the Babylonians, Persians, Assyrians, Sumerians, and Akkadians, there were many gods who were considered the personifications of fortune and wealth, such as Ziku and Bogu. Ziku was not only the god of fortune, but he was also commonly depicted as an associate of the patron god of Babylon, namely Marduk, whereas Bogu was considered the god of wealth, though he wasn't the only god of wealth, as there was the goddess of wealth, Ashna, though in her case she represented wealth through grain and livestock, given how in those days having a lot of livestock or grains for a harvest would make one very wealthy, right? Along with other gods that represented similar attributes, such as Lathar and Enkidu. Well, not Enkidu, but Enkidu was I assume, a separate being who represented farming in general, along with serving as a model as to how one could become a healthy, wealthy, and wise farmer to the people, with Lathar, who was considered a fellow creation god that also served as a similar model to Enkidu. Now, in Egyptian mythology, there were also gods that were connected to wealth through farming and crops, along with cattle, such as the goddess Hathor, who was considered the goddess of mineral wealth, such as gold, silver, precious, and semi precious stones. I mean, why else would Egypt be considered one of the most wealthy kingdoms of the ancient past? She also served as a goddess who resided over cattle and abundance festivals, as she's often depicted as being cow like or having a cow's head, given how cows were and are still considered valuable in their own right due to providing dairy and meat for the people. Though, kind of like, I guess, how Indian people had a similar view regarding cows. Though, the unlike people in India, or Hindus especially, who worship cows to the point of never harming or eating them, the Egyptians had no problem still eating for sustenance because that's what cows were mostly raised for. As for the festival aspect of her worship, festivals were often performed in her favor due to the abundance of harvests and cattle that grew for Egyptian farmers and peasants, and it was considered a time of celebration for them because of it. There was another Egyptian goddess who was kind of similar to Hathor named Renenutet, who is also considered a goddess of wealth, though in her case she is more associated with the harvest rather than cattle and minerals, while also being the goddess of nourishment and well-being, which is definitely what one would need in order to survive, especially around those ages. And another, well, rather minor god who was considered a god of wealth in his own right was Bes, who was, well, in this case, a household god who basically served as a good luck charm to the families who lived there by protecting them from bad luck, which included financial ruin, while not exactly serving as a standard or conventional wealth or money god. He still counted as he was trying to prevent people from becoming, I guess, poor or having really bad, like, luck with wealth or whatever. Now, as I mentioned before, Hinduism and Buddhism, especially, there were plenty of gods or deities that served as gods of fortune, wealth, prosperity, and riches in general, which is kind of ironic considering in Buddhism's case, you're actually supposed to, or at least most of the sects, usually try to abstain from wealthy or materialistic desires, but I guess that depends on which one. But going to Hinduism, there was the elephant god Ganesh, who served as the god of intellect, wisdom, and along with being a remover of obstacles. And he even serves as a patron to artists and scientists. And as a result, in Jainism, he is considered the god of wealth for these very reasons, as one would need to avoid financial obstacles, along with wanting to have someone be the patron in case you were to take up a more scientific or even artistic career. And there, for the female side, there is Lakshmi, who is seen as a deity representing wealth, albeit in a more subtle manner, as she is not only the goddess of good fortune and is often portrayed as having golden coins surrounding her or even being poured from her hands, but she's also considered the goddess of beauty and love. This is due to the fact that beauty and wealth often overlap in this case, as many would enjoy being rich while also having a sense of beauty and attractiveness about them, especially in the case of love. And because of this, her name is often used by parents for their daughters, as if invoking Lakshmi herself will bring them good luck, as well as blessing their daughters with beauty. Though personally, I believe that beauty is in the eye of the beholder due to how subjective it can be, and that real beauty is often more important within a person's heart, mind, and soul rather than simply their physical appearance. And another god who is considered the god of wealth, or in this case the lord of wealth, is Kubera. The reason for this is not only because he's considered the king of the Yaksha spirits, but it's also due to him being considered a counterpart to the Buddhist god Vajravana, or if you are Japanese, Bishamonten, who was considered one of the four heavenly kings and a very important figure in both Buddhism and Jainism. And speaking of Bishamonten, he, along with Kubera, are considered one of the five main Jambalas of Buddhism, namely the Black Jambala, as there are five of them known as the green, red, yellow, and white Jambala, with the Black Jambala being the fifth member. Though the Black Jambala is considered the king of the West, and he is considered a god of wealth in Tibetan Buddhist culture. And he is also considered a manifestation of the Bodhisattva Amoghasiddhi, who helped purify people from envy and protects them from debt and bad luck in general. The other four Jambalas do represent wealth, albeit in different ways. Like, for example, the White Jambala, who is also associated with Kuan Yin for you Journey to the West fans, is considered the most compassionate, merciful, as she is said to heal the poor, the sick, the cursed, and the remover of bad karma. Like Vajravana, she's seen as connected to the four heavenly kings as well, like namely Tarastra or Jikokuten, who is often symbolized as having white as his main theme color and is considered the compassionate king of the east, whereas Bishamonten represents the north. The green Jambala is considered the chief of all the five Jambalas and is often depicted as carrying a mongoose that spits out jewels, representing generosity, while killing the snakes that represent envy and greed. He also has the ability to transmute anything negative to something more positive, thus hinting at him also being a god of fortune or good luck. The yellow Jambala is considered one of the more powerful and popular members, as he is said to remove poverty from all six realms in the universe, while increasing the lifespan, wisdom, and virtues of living beings. He too is considered an aspect of Vajravana, like the green Jambala, due to having his domain being in the north, along with spreading charity and fortune to others, not to mention his theme colors tend to vary from either green or yellow. And finally, there is the red Jambala, who represents prosperity through harmonious marriage, and is considered to be married to the mother of wealth herself. Not only that, he is considered an aspect of Ganesha, who is already considered a god of wealth, like I mentioned before, thus showing just how connected Buddhism and Hinduism is through their respective deities. Though personally, I'm not really sure how all these money gods fit with traditional Buddhism, as I'm pretty sure the early sects of Buddhism didn't even have gods and focused more on abstaining from material worldly desires while seeking to leave the cycle of life, death, and reincarnation in general. Now, continuing into Buddhism, or at least the Japanese connection to Buddhism, there is Bishamonten, who is considered to be a god of wealth in Japanese culture. However, what you may not know is that on every Japanese New Year, Bishamonten would arrive in the houses of people, similar to Santa Claus. Though in this case, he and his fellow gods, known as the Fukujin, or the seven lucky gods, or the gods of fortune, would visit the homes and bless the people living there, as long as they made and placed kagami, or mirror rice cakes, in certain areas of their home for each god to reside in until the new year, and each god is used to be worshipped separately by merchants in the past before they slowly came together as a special group that became more collectively worshipped and even displayed in many forms of art. Like other than Bishamonten, there was Ebisu Daikokoten, like I mentioned earlier, Benzaiten, Jurojin, Hotei, and either Fukurokuju or Kichijoten. They are usually depicted on a special ship to herald their arrival and bless the ones who choose to welcome them. Like with the Jambalas, each god was based on a pre-existing god from Buddhism, Hinduism, and added with Shinto or Taoism. Interestingly, though, out of all the gods, only one of them, like namely Hotei or Budai, was the was the only one based on an actual historical figure, and another god who was imported from Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism is Mahakala, who is seen as another household god, kind of like Bes, although in this case he wasn't really considered a wealth god, at least from the original religion that he came from, but rather he was just basically a house god who represented the wealth of the households that people lived in. Speaking of Taoism, they too have their fair share of wealth gods, represented wealth, good fortune, and prosperity. Like, for example, Kai Shen is often the go to god of wealth, given how he's often depicted as being surrounded by coins and money of all kind. Liu Haichen is considered his other self, or rather his other face, who is an alchemist that created money, at least judging from how he's symbolized by gold coins. And an older god of wealth known as Fude Chengshen, though he was more focused on blessed virtues rather than monetary gain, was also considered a god of wealth in its own right. And like with some of the previous gods, Tudi Gong is considered a god of wealth through farming and soil, kind of like Hathor and Kindu. And going back to Buddhism, the Bodhisattva Kuan Yu, no, not Kuan Yin, he is considered a guardian deity of wealth in Chinese folk religions such as Buddhism, Taoism, and even Confucianism, along with having been worshipped in parts like Hong Kong and even Southeast Asia. And going back to Europe, we have many gods and goddesses who represent wealth through prosperity, money, livestock, or harvest in general. Like in Greek mythology, we have Hermes, who, like Red from OSB, considers to be a true millennial icon due to having multiple part-time jobs. Like with one of his duties being the god of merchants. Then again, he was also considered the god of thieves and tricksters. So the implication of that can be quite unsettling or a bit strange at times, whatever. And Hades, as you probably did or did not know, was also considered a god of wealth, albeit through various minerals and precious metals that often appear in the underworld, kind of like Hathor, who also was considered the goddess of minerals and gemstones in her domain. In fact, his Roman name Pluto actually means the wealthy one because of how the minerals that appear in the underworld would, in a sense, make him wealthy due to how much treasure jewelry he has. And as a result, he was either mixed up or conflated with another god named Plutus due to having similar roles and names. So the only difference was that Plutus had, well, as far as I know, no relation to Zeus other than being blinded by him so he could share his wealth with mortals without discrimination. And Plutus was more of an agricultural wealth god rather than a mineral based one. There were minor gods such as Avarunkus and Agathodaimon who protected people from financial ruin and other forms of harm, kind of like Bes from Egypt, and lived in grain fields or vineyards to provide harvest for farmers, respectively. And fun fact, Agathodaimon himself is considered the husband to the goddess Tyche, who herself is a goddess of fortune, though in her case, she was the goddess of both good and bad fortune due to how fickle fortune or luck can be depending on the person. And Tyche in Roman culture was given the name Fortuna, though her role is basically the same as her Greek counterpart. Though if you want to go for a more literal case of a money god or a money-based god, there is the goddess Moneta, whose face is literally plastered onto coins due to her name being the basis for both money and the mint itself, as she protects both the funds and memories of her followers. Oh, and remember how I mentioned that Hathor was considered the goddess of abundant festivals? Well, there is Abundantia herself, who, if the name didn't tip you off, was literally the personification of abundance and prosperity. And you'll often see her holding a cornucopia in her hands, like the same kind that one would see around Thanksgiving or something similar, as part of her duty. And she's considered a reminder of the golden age of Greek mythology as a result. And in Celtic mythology, there is a similar goddess to fortune, abundance, and prosperity named Vesuna, and you could say she's kind of like a combination of Abundantia and Fortuna, and was even adopted into Roman culture because of it. Though going further to, I guess, the north part of Europe, there was in Norse mythology, the gods Freya, Freyr, Sif, and of course, how can we forget about Loki? Similar to how Lakshmi's status as the goddess of love and beauty made her wealthy, Freya held that status as well due to also being a fertility and magic goddess. It is also prominent considering how she's often portrayed as wearing beautiful golden jewelry, and since beauty is considered to be a valuable treasure in its own right, of course she would be considered a goddess of wealth as a result, and her brother or male counterpart Freyr is, like with so many other deities, he's considered an agricultural or harvest deity due to how, like with other cultures, having a large abundance of harvests will allow you to, I guess, like have more food and therefore have more wealth. And Sif, who is well traditionally the wife of Thor himself, is similar to Freya, considering how she's often depicted as having blonde hair, and given how blonde hair was seen as similar to gold, and thus was associated with the mineral of the same name, or the golden sheen of wheat and grain during harvest season, of course it would make sense that she too is considered a harvest goddess in her own right. And like with Hermes, like Loki the trickster was considered to be sort of a wealth god, although in this case he was more of a financial advisor, unlike Hermes, and he often had to use his wits to get the Aesir, or like say the real Asgardians, out of sticky financial situations, such as the incident involving the payment regarding how Aesir had to be fortified, and the gods had no way of repaying the builders. Moving all the way to Africa and beyond, the gods that I could find who were the closest thing to wealth gods were Ikenga and Dedun. Ikenga was once worshipped as a god by the Nigerian people, who not only had a wealth and fortune god, but he was also considered the god of personal power and strength, right? And though while Dedun is still remembered as a Nubian god, though unlike other gods who were associated with coins, farming, and luck as their main, I guess, produce of wealth. Like Dedun was more associated with incense trading due to incense being seen as incredibly valuable at the time, kind of like how in the Bible states there was the wise men who offered frankincense, gold, and myrrh as their main gifts. Though there are some cultures in the modern day who also believe that incense is pretty valuable, so you can't really exclude that from gold or grain. In voodoo culture, due to how voodoo is basically a combination of mainly African culture along with some various other European cultures or even Hispanic cultures. Like there was the Loa, Anaisa Pie, who was considered both a patron saint and the Loa of love, money, and happiness. Though whether they meant by how she could bring you money to buy happiness or not is unknown. Interestingly enough, she kind of resembles the Virgin Mary, though this could be because of how voodoo tends to be very syncretic and adopts other cultures, like even from Catholic beliefs, like as shown with how you see a lot of Catholic imagery with some of the voodoo sects. Going to the Americas, both North and South, there were plenty of gods who reigned over wealth and prosperity in their own way. In North American Pacific culture, there was Kumugwe, the copper maker, who was worshipped by the Native American tribes that resided there, who, well, like his name, like copper was considered valuable when it comes to making money, kind of like how other gods and minerals also made money and wealth through that kind of substance. In South and Central America, there was the Aztec god Yacatuquehitli, who was the patron god of commerce and merchants, kind of like Hermes. Whereas in Bolivian indigenous cultures, there was Ekeko, who was the god of prosperity and abundance, like some of the previously mentioned gods, like Abundantia. Though in this case, I think Ekeko was male. Like, as you can see, each god is associated with a certain form of wealth and riches, along with prosperity, beauty, treasure, money, farming, business, and etc., as they show how people used to make money through various different methods in the ancient past, though they may have had some negative undertones regarding some of these concepts like slave trade and labor. It is important to understand why and how these gods of money and wealth came to be worshipped, but like I said before, we shouldn't be blinded by riches or even the idea of riches itself, as it can bring about disastrous consequences that not even money can save you from, so beware of that if you can.